The lights were burning hot. Every camera in that room was pointed at Mike Tyson, but nobody could have predicted what was about to happen in the next 7 seconds. The press conference had started like any other, routine, controlled, the kind of event Mike had sat through 100 times before. The room was packed with reporters, notebooks open, pens ready, cameras rolling. Everyone was waiting for the usual questions, the usual answers, the usual back and forth between fighter and media. But this time, something was different. You could feel it in the air, thick and heavy like the moment before a storm breaks. Mike sat on stage, hands resting on the table in front of him, fingers interlocked, eyes staring straight ahead. To everyone watching, he looked calm, composed, maybe even bored. But if you knew Mike Tyson, if you really knew him, you'd see the signs. The way his jaw tightened just slightly, the way his shoulders were tense under his jacket, the way his breathing was controlled, deliberate, like he was holding something back. And he was. Because Mike had been holding things back his entire life. The room buzzed with low conversation, reporters shuffling papers, camera operators adjusting their equipment, publicists whispering instructions. It was organized chaos, the kind Mike had learned to navigate over the years. But deep down, he hated these events. He hated the questions that never went beneath the surface, the assumptions people made without knowing a damn thing about him, the way they looked at him like he was some kind of animal in a cage, dangerous, unpredictable, something to be watched from a safe distance. Then one of the reporters stood up. Middle-aged guy, probably in his late 40s, wearing a tailored suit that screamed money and privilege. His hair was perfectly combed, his shoes polished, everything about him said he'd never struggled a day in his life. He grabbed the microphone with the kind of confidence that comes from never being told no, never being put in his place, never having to fight for respect. And when he spoke, his voice cut through the room like a knife. "Mike, I got a question for you," he said, and there was something in his tone, something condescending, something that made everyone in the room stop and listen. "You're just a street thug, aren't you? I mean, let's be real here. You got lucky in boxing, sure, but without those gloves, without the fame, you're nothing but trouble from the hood. What do you say to that?" The room went dead silent. Not the kind of silence where people are thinking, but the kind where everyone's holding their breath, waiting to see what happens next. Some reporters looked uncomfortable, shifting in their seats, eyes darting between Mike and the guy who just asked the question. Others leaned forward, hungry for drama, for conflict, for something they could turn into a headline. Cameras zoomed in on Mike's face, trying to catch every micro-expression, every flicker of emotion. But Mike didn't move. Not yet. He sat there, hands still on the table, eyes locked on that reporter, and for about 3 seconds that felt like 3 hours, the entire world seemed to stop. His jaw clenched tighter. You could see the muscle working under his skin, but his face remained still, unreadable. And in that moment, everyone in that room was wondering the same thing. What is Mike Tyson going to do? But here's what nobody in that room understood. That question, those words, that disrespect, it wasn't new to Mike. He'd heard it his whole life, in different forms from different people, but always the same message. You're not good enough, you're just a product of the streets, you're dangerous, you're a thug, you're less than human. And every single time, it cut him the same way. Mike's mind flashed back, and suddenly he wasn't sitting in that press conference anymore. He was 10 years old, standing in a Brooklyn alley, getting jumped by older kids who saw him as an easy target. He was overweight, had a lisp that made other kids laugh, wore clothes that didn't fit because his family couldn't afford better. They called him names, pushed him around, took whatever little he had. And when he fought back, when he finally snapped and threw his first real punch, they called him an animal, a monster, a thug. Even then, even as a kid just trying to survive, people were labeling him, boxing him in, telling him who he was supposed to be. He remembered being in school, struggling to read, teachers looking at him like he was a lost cause, like he'd end up in prison or dead before he turned 18. He remembered the system, the group homes, the feeling of being passed around like he didn't matter, like he was just another broken kid from a broken neighborhood with no future and no hope. He remembered the streets of Brownsville, where violence wasn't a choice, it was survival, where you either learned to fight or you became a victim, and Mike refused to be a victim ever again. And then he remembered Cus D'Amato, the old boxing trainer who saw something in Mike that nobody else did, who took him in when everyone else had given up on him, who taught him not just how to fight in the ring, but how to fight in life. Cus used to tell him, "Mike, the world is going to try to define you. They're going to look at where you came from, the color of your skin, the way you talk, and they're going to put you in a box. Your job isn't to prove them wrong with violence. It's to prove them wrong by becoming more than they ever thought you could be." Mike came back to the present, to the press conference, to the reporter still standing there with that smug look on his face, waiting for an answer, probably expecting Mike to explode, to yell, to prove exactly what he'd just accused him of being. And for a split second, Mike felt that old rage rising up, the same rage that had gotten him in trouble so many times before, the same rage that made people fear him, that made them see him as dangerous. But then something else kicked in. Control. Discipline. The lessons Cus had drilled into him over and over again. Mike leaned forward slowly, deliberately, his movements calm but purposeful. The microphone picked up the sound of his breath, and when he spoke, his voice was low, controlled, but everyone in that room could feel the weight behind every word. "You think you know me," he said, and the question hung in the air like a challenge. "You think because you read some headlines, watched some clips on TV, sat in your comfortable office and formed an opinion that you understand where I came from." The reporter's smile wavered just slightly, but he didn't back down. Not yet. He still thought he had the upper hand, still thought this was going to go the way he planned. But Mike wasn't done. "Me tell you something," Mike continued, and his eyes never left the reporter's face. "I've been called worse by better people than you. I've been looked down on by people who actually lived the life you're pretending to understand. So when you call me a street thug, when you try to reduce everything I've survived, everything I've overcome to some label you think defines me, all you're doing is showing me how little you actually know." The room was so quiet you could hear the hum of the cameras. Some reporters started scribbling notes frantically. Others just sat there, frozen, watching this unfold. The guy who asked the question. His face was starting to turn red, but he still hadn't sat down, hadn't backed off. And Mike could see it in his eyes, that pride, that refusal to admit he'd crossed a line. "You see a thug," Mike said, his voice rising slightly, not in anger, but in passion, in truth. "I see a survivor. You see trouble. I see a kid who had to fight just to eat, just to have a place to sleep at night without getting robbed or beaten. You see the hood. I see the place that made me who I am, the place that taught me strength, resilience, the kind of lessons you can't learn in a classroom or read about in a book." And then Mike did something nobody expected. He paused, took a breath, and when he spoke again, his voice was softer, almost reflective. "Yeah, maybe I'm not perfect. Maybe I made mistakes. Maybe I've done things I'm not proud of, but I'm still standing here. I survived a childhood that would have broken most people. I survived a system that was designed to crush people like me. I survived being told over and over again that I was nothing, that I'd never be anything. And now I'm sitting on this stage, world champion, and you're asking me if I'm just a street thug." The reporter finally sat down. No response, no comeback, nothing. His face was flushed, and you could see the regret starting to set in, the realization that he'd just embarrassed himself in front of a room full of his peers, in front of cameras that were broadcasting this moment to the world. He thought he was going to rattle Mike Tyson, maybe get a dramatic reaction, create a headline. Instead, he got a reality check he'd never forget. But here's where the story goes deeper, where it becomes about more than just a press conference, more than just one disrespectful question. Because when Mike walked out of that building later that day, after the cameras stopped rolling, after the reporters packed up their equipment and left, something inside him shifted. He'd been carrying anger for so long. using it as fuel, as protection, as a way to keep the world at arm's length. But in that moment, responding to that reporter, he realized something profound. The reporter wasn't the enemy. The reporter was just another person who didn't understand, who saw the surface and made assumptions, who let stereotypes and headlines shape his view of reality. And Mike. He'd spent years doing the same thing to himself, internalizing those labels, believing on some level that maybe they were right, that maybe he was just a product of his environment, defined by his worst moments instead of his best ones. Cus D'Amato had died years before, but his words were still with Mike, echoing in his mind like a guide he could always come back to. The world will try to define you, Mike. They'll put you in a box, label you, limit you. Your job isn't to fight them with your fists. It's to prove them wrong with your life. And standing outside that venue, breathing in the cool evening air, Mike finally understood what Cus had been trying to teach him all along. Here's the thing most people don't know about Mike Tyson, the thing that doesn't make it into the highlight reels or the documentaries. Yes, he was one of the most feared fighters in history. Yes, he could knock someone out in seconds, and a fight before most people even realized it had started. But his real fight, his hardest fight, was never in the ring. It was in his mind, in his heart, against the voices that told him he wasn't good enough, that he was just a thug from Brooklyn, that he'd never be more than what people expected him to be. That reporter thought he was exposing Mike, revealing some truth about who he really was. But all he did was remind Mike of how far he'd come. From a kid in Brownsville who couldn't read properly, who got bullied relentlessly, who turned to the streets because there was nowhere else to go, to a world champion sitting on a stage being questioned by someone who'd never walked a single day in his shoes, never felt hunger, never felt the fear of not knowing if you'd make it through the night. And the silence that followed Mike's response, that wasn't just shock, it was respect. Even the people in that room who didn't like Mike, who came in with their own biases and preconceptions, had to pause and think. Because Mike didn't yell, didn't threaten, didn't do what they expected him to do. He did something more powerful, something that required more strength than any punch he'd ever thrown. He spoke his truth, raw and unfiltered, and the truth was undeniable. Now imagine being that reporter. You walk into a press conference thinking you're going to make a name for yourself, get a reaction, maybe go viral with a clip of Mike Tyson losing his temper. And instead, you get hit with reality. Not with fists, but with words that cut deeper than any physical blow ever could. You realize in that moment that you didn't just disrespect a boxer, you disrespected a human being who survived things you could never imagine, who fought battles you'll never have to fight, who earned every single thing he has through blood, sweat, and an unbreakable will to survive. But wait, because this story doesn't end there. It keeps going, keeps unfolding in ways that reveal even more about who Mike Tyson really is. Years later, that same reporter wrote an article. Not about boxing, not about Mike's record in the ring, but about that press conference. He admitted he was wrong. He said he walked in with assumptions, looking for drama, treating Mike like a character instead of a person. And he walked out understanding something he'd never considered before, that every person, no matter who they are, no matter where they come from, carries a story. And judging someone without knowing their story, without understanding their struggle, that's the real ignorance. The article went deeper. The reporter talked about his own privilege, his own blind spots, the way he'd been conditioned to see people like Mike as dangerous, as less than, as stereotypes instead of individuals. He wrote about how that moment changed him, how it forced him to confront his own biases, his own assumptions about the world. And he ended the article with an apology, not just to Mike, but to everyone he'd ever looked down on, everyone he'd ever judged without understanding. Mike never responded publicly to that article. He didn't need to. The point had already been made. And for Mike, it wasn't about being right or wrong. It wasn't about winning some argument or proving a point. It was about standing in his truth, about refusing to let other people's ignorance define him, about showing the world that strength isn't just physical, it's mental, emotional, spiritual. See, Mike Tyson didn't need to knock that guy out. He didn't need to prove his power with violence, didn't need to give people what they expected, what they wanted to see. He proved his power with presence, with control, with the kind of strength that doesn't come from muscles or training. It comes from surviving hell and choosing not to let it define you, not to let it turn you into the monster everyone expects you to be. So when you watch that clip, if you ever see it, when you see Mike's face in that moment, the way his eyes lock onto that reporter, the way he speaks with such conviction and control, remember this. The most dangerous thing about Mike Tyson was never his fists. It was his ability to take everything the world threw at him, every insult, every stereotype, every attempt to break him, and turn it into fuel. The streets didn't break him, the system didn't break him, and a disrespectful reporter sure as hell wasn't going to break him either. 7 seconds. That's all it took. 7 seconds for Mike to remind everyone in that room, and everyone watching around the world, that respect isn't given because of where you come from or how you look or what people assume about you. It's earned by how you carry yourself when people try to tear you down, by how you respond when the world tries to make you feel small, by how you stand tall even when everything inside you is screaming to lash out, to fight back the way you used to, the way people expect you to. And Mike Tyson, he carried himself like a champion that day. Not just a boxing champion, but a champion of life, of resilience, of refusing to be defined by other people's limitations. The reporter learned what so many others had learned before him. Don't mistake silence for weakness. Don't mistake a rough past for a lack of intelligence. And definitely, absolutely, never mistake Mike Tyson for just another fighter. Because the real fight, the one that mattered most, the one that defined who Mike truly was, wasn't about throwing punches or knocking people out. It was about standing tall when the world tried to make you feel small, about speaking truth when lies were easier, about being human when everyone expected you to be a monster.